All right, verses 35 through 38. Wrap up this chapter. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Keep a finger here and flip back to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23. And compare Matthew chapter 4, verse 23 to Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. And what do you discover? They're the same. They're the exact same verse. They're identical. And it's as if Matthew uses that as a bracket to identify, okay, here's a section. And now, with the other bracket, now we're going to move on to another section in his gospel. Verse 36 says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. And what that means is that he felt for these people deep down inside. Okay? It's actually a word that talks about intestinal stuff. Okay? But he feels this deep down inside. And the reason he felt for the people was because their shepherds were not giving them help, guidance, comfort, love, and encouragement. Instead, all the Jewish religious leaders did was tell them that they weren't good enough and that they needed to do more, they needed to do better, they needed to buck up, they needed to perform to their standard, to the religious leaders' standard. And the people felt beaten down. And the people felt underappreciated. And Jesus' heart goes out to them. He has compassion on them because of this. Now again, keep something here in Matthew chapter 9 and turn in the Old Testament to the book of Ezekiel. All right, Ezekiel chapter 34 verses 1 through 6 says this. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. And that's what Jesus sees when he looks out at the crowd. That's what he sees. If we were to continue reading in Ezekiel 34, what we would read is that God says to the Jewish religious leaders, since you won't do what you're supposed to do in caring for my people, I will do it myself, he says. He says, I will come and shepherd my people. But, he says, because I am doing it, you shepherds who aren't doing it, you're not going to be blessed. So, Jesus came as the great shepherd. But here in Matthew, back to Matthew now, here in Matthew, what Jesus is doing is, as the great shepherd, he's delegating ministry. He's delegating ministry. And partway through this, he talks about you saw the crowds, you had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then the imagery changes. He says, then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. So here, the imagery changes from a flock of sheep to a harvest field. And Jesus is only emphasizing one part of the shepherd's responsibility right here, and that is to seek the lost. What else did we see they were supposed to do? Well, they're supposed to feed the mature, they're supposed to bind up the hurting, they're supposed to teach the young, and they're supposed to search for the lost, Ezekiel says. Okay, so he's emphasizing just one part of the ministry here. But the point is that Jesus is beginning to prepare and hand off ministry to his disciples. So as that responsibility was passed to disciples and then down through the centuries, who has the responsibility to shepherd and harvest today? That's right. We all do. We all do. We all should have people in our lives that we're shepherding, discipling, and people that we're trying to bring to Christ, praying for, talking with, building relationships with. Now, look again at these last two verses. Okay, the last two verses. What does it mean that the harvest is plentiful? There's a lot of people who are ripe. There are a lot of people who are ripe and ready. What does it mean that the workers are few? Not enough, right? There's people out there who would come to Christ if somebody would go to them and tell them of Christ. And what happens when the harvest is plentiful, but there are few workers? The stuff dies in the field. So, we are to be the harvesters. There's people who are ripe to come to Christ. It's up to us whether they are brought in or whether they end up just laying out in the field.